Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me on a Saturday as we continue our day text readings. As those of you who have joined me previously know, we're in the letter of Jude, near the end of the New Testament, right before Revelation, which we'll get to next. So we started Jude yesterday by reading verses 1 through 5. As those of you who are part of the day text shows know, I grouped together various texts to try to give us something to read that isn't too involved so we can talk about it and get the sense of the most important things, rather than have so many things come up that it's hard to really give attention, proper attention to each one. Sometimes that happens because the texts just have so much information, right? But we do our best to make the most use of select readings so that we can remember the key points. And so what I've done is I've grouped together texts. Sometimes they're part of like an ongoing narrative, and so it's not so easy to decide, where you want to break. And so, at times we'll just do a part of a narrative and then the next part the next time. So we don't always cover everything completely when we do these day texts. They're just meant to be brief selections of texts, usually 2 to 5 verses, that will allow us to look at a condensed version or section of the text and then talk about it and get the most out of it before we move on to the next text. All right, with that in mind, we're going to be reading Jude verses 6 through 10. And I'm going to go ahead and get started because there's a lot of information that we'll, I'm sure, discuss. So let's go ahead and do it. Jude verse 6. Remember, he started out this letter. If you were a part of yesterday's day text, or you watched the video, or you just read Jude 1 through 5, you can see that Jude, whom many believe to be a half sibling of Jesus, wants to talk about salvation. He wants to talk about their shared belief in the things that Jesus came and accomplished, so that they can be built up with joy and in the hope for the future. But he doesn't do that because he's more concerned at this point with other people who have infiltrated. That's the term that I translated infiltration, but it's what the term Jude used indicates. Certain people have infiltrated the gathering of Christians in order to mislead them into ways of morality that have really little, if anything at all, to do with Jah. So that's what his focus has turned to, from salvation to these infiltrators. And when you think of infiltration, what do you think of? Right? There's usually a sinister element to it, especially if, for example, you're in the military, right? If someone's infiltrating your group, you're in real trouble. But that's really true of any group. Just because military operations are more significant in terms of potential loss of life or sensitive information, that could happen also in any setting if we're not careful. And we let other people who aren't honest with us and who practice lying. They're not just making mistakes. They're not trying to deceive you, mislead other people, and that's why they're in your group. You need to stand up to those people, right? What does the Bible refer to Jesus as and to other Christians as? Shepherds. What did Jesus say would happen when the shepherd is a good shepherd? He defends the sheep, right? Against the wolves. But the false shepherd doesn't do that. The false shepherd lets in these wolves and the sheep are destroyed. So we cannot allow that kind of destruction to take place if we can help it. Good morning to everybody. And I'll kind of go over names near the end, and we'll retrace a few things. But if I didn't say good morning already, say it again now. I usually start out that way, so hopefully I did. Either way, We're going to be getting to the reading here, but just keep that in mind. Infiltration. Infiltration is someone trying to infiltrate your group, your family, your military, your country. You need to be on the watch for those kinds of people because they're not being honest with you. They're not telling you what they're really doing. They're lying. And if you can't tell that, if you can't determine that, or if they deceive you, you could be in some really serious trouble. So this is something we should all keep in mind. The first part of Jude's letter, 1 through 5, we really do want to talk about salvation, but we have all these people that we have to be worried about. And until we address them and help others be aware of them, it's hard to talk about things like salvation because we have so many threats that are right there if we're not careful. All right, let's take a look at the reading and see how this further applies. Starting in verse 6, we're going to read verses 6 through 10. So keep that in mind. He's writing to them about an urgent matter. Infiltrators, liars, people who are not honest with you, who are trying to damage you. Verse 6. Also remember the angels who did not pay close attention to their own beginning, but rather who gave up their own place of dwelling only to be restrained with continual bonds under the authority of a dark place. I'm going to kind of stop after each verse and talk about it because it would be too much to go back over the material in this case because each text really has its own set of information related to the ongoing topic, which is the urgency about the infiltrators. So he's talking about, when you talk about infiltrators, right? I mean, so the angels, here they are, the sons of God, created by Jah to have measures of authority over various parts of creation or to act on his behalf in ways that he authorizes. But some angels didn't keep in mind their beginning, how they were made, what they were supposed to do. Well, like humans today, what is our beginning? How were we born? Male or female? Well, a lot of people today aren't paying attention to that anymore, are they? They're forgetting their own beginning and giving up their gender or their nature or what their creation has given them to do things they weren't made to do. And that's exactly what you have here. We're going to get to that in a moment with regard to humans in the next verse, but I want to bring that up so you understand by analogy how different intelligent beings in God's image can be made one way and then live completely differently or not in accordance with how they're made. So these angels, it doesn't specify in this case exactly what they did, although many associate this with the pre-flood times when the sons of God, according to Genesis 6, may have taken the daughters of men and produced children such as the giants or Nephilim. It's not entirely clear in that account in Genesis exactly who the sons of God are, but we know they're in contrast to the daughters of men, like I explained in my Sons of God in Pre-Christian Text video. So, whether or not that's what Jude's referring to here or not, the fact is, these angels were punished because they didn't pay attention to their beginning. Now let's look at verse 7. Remember how Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities surrounding them lived openly, obviously immoral lives, by chasing after different types of flesh. These things are set before them as an indication of continual destruction, which is what they undergo as a punishment. And now you may notice in the video I did, the God Jah, the great message that I did several months back, how I showed video of the area of Sodom and Gomorrah and how the cities have been totally destroyed right there on the edge of the Dead Sea. And you can even see giant sulfur pellets embedded all around in the areas where the structures were located and the remnants of those structures. Exactly like the Bible teaches. Yet no one really talks about that today. How often do you see a show or a news update that says, alert, we have evidence of total destruction of very bad people in the past. We might want to start thinking about this. No, they go right on and try to recreate Sodom and Gomorrah. You even had Stephen Colbert welcoming people at the Oscars, I believe the show was, as the Sodomites. Such a dummy. In any case, it says they went chasing after different types of flesh. And you know from my Let's Talk Sodomy video that sodomy in the original sense of Sodom and Gomorrah involved abusive attraction towards people of the same gender that isn't returned. It's abusive because you're allowing your attraction and desire for a person of the same sex or gender to override the other person's acceptance or rejection of your desire. So the Sodomites, in the case of the angels who visited Lot, they didn't care if the angels wanted them to abuse them or not. Ultimately, they didn't care if Lot wanted them to abuse them or not. They tolerated Lot, but once he tried to prevent them from sodomizing the visiting guests, then they were going to sodomize him as well. Even worse, they said. We're going to do worse to you. So sodomy in the original sense, it does lead to the type of things we associate with it today. Anal sex, completely abusive. No redeeming value to anal sex. It only destroys both parties and never leads to reproduction, obviously. Yet people keep doing it anyway. They get that option. And then they get the judgment that God's going to render to them for abusing their bodies and not paying attention to their own beginning. Right? They're not recognizing what is so obvious it's a part of their actual person, their physicality. And different people may have certain hormonal imbalances or things that can at times create disruptions in our biochemistry and lead to things that may involve things like sodomy or sin that either we accept or reject and we feel bad about and repent. But to continue to involve yourself with abusive lifestyles and practices, not just sinning because we're all sinful at times and we make mistakes, but to get involved in openly, obviously immoral lives by abusing someone else against their will, especially someone of the same gender, because you could only really damage them in addition to violating their choice. You would have to be damaging them sexually if you're going to perform those kinds of acts on the same gender, because the organs don't line up. Very obvious humanity biology 101. It's like something you learn before even biology, humanity, anatomy, world 101, right? Because we're born with our physicality. We know about it before anybody really has to tell us. Yet these people will absolutely forget all that and misuse their body and other people's body repeatedly. Even in the case of the Sodomites, if the other party isn't willing. See, in today, many places, homosexuality is legal. So when people do it willingly together, they're really not following after the Sodomites. They may be practicing a form of sodomy relative to what ultimately would have been involved in the sodomite behavior. But two homosexuals who willingly sodomize each other, that's up to them. You know, they'll get their own judgment and the consequences of their actions. But that's not willing anal abuse is not really sodomy. It's sodomy today. But the original sodomy is abusive attraction and attempt to abuse someone of the same gender against their will. They don't want it. That's what the Sodomites were doing. But they were also doing these things in other ways that led up to the judgment that Jah gave before we have them actually trying to overrule Lot and the angels in terms of what they wanted. So maybe they were just doing all these things in more open ways without the type of abuse we see them performing with Lot and the angels. But either way, we know that's what really tipped the scales. So today we have to be tolerant of those who are at least not abusing people against their will, because anal sex or sodomy in that sense is legal in many places. And we're not here to get involved in people's lives or try to stop them from doing what they choose to do. As long as they're not hurting someone against their will, they're going to have to answer for those decisions. But if they are, someone's being abused against their will, that's a whole different deal. And we should get involved to help the person who's being abused. So, just like Lot attempted to help the visiting guests when he thought they were going to be abused. Okay, and then in verse 8 it says, in fact, it kind of carries on with this idea of the Sodom and Gomorrahites chasing after different types of flesh. It says in verse 8, in fact, in the same way, these ones are obsessed all the time with flesh. On the one hand, tell me who you think this sounds like. Not necessarily as a who as in a person, but as in a group or a place. You'll see where I'm going. In the same way, these ones are obsessed all the time with flesh. And on the one hand, as an affront to authority. But they are also rejecting the presence of glorious beings and even blaspheming. So, and when I read this, I think immediately of Hollywood. They're obsessed with flesh. They're doing all of the things they can think of, from pansexuality, of course, all the homosexuality. By pansexuality, I mean pedo, I mean bestiality. They do it and promote it all. And they are openly affronting authority or disrespecting authority because they're rejecting the presence of glorious beings, right? They even mockingly appeal to Lucifer and things like that, whether it's a real being in their mind or not. The point is, there are beings present. They're here. So while the people in Hollywood and elsewhere don't accept their presence, that doesn't change the fact that they're there. At least we believe they're there because we're here, and everything else shows that the things that we're taught in these texts is reliable and based on the best available evidence. So if what we've been taught and come to believe with regard to Jah, Jesus, and Christianity, the devil, the spirits, all these things is true, then they're here and aware of us all the time. Yet these people in Hollywood and elsewhere act in these sick and disgusting ways, even though they have the example of Sodom and Gomorrah right in front of them. The cities are still there, totally destroyed, with the agent of destruction embedded in it, in them, as a reminder of Jah's judgment. So now, of course, remember, Jah was willing to spare the cities if even 10 were found. He eventually got to that number. But at first, it was so outrageous. And of course, all humans are sinners anyway. So his mercy was simply extended through the appeals of Abraham. But they have these cities right there. That's why they don't report on them. That's why they welcome each other as sodomites. They are openly affronting authority and rejecting the presence of Jah's angels and glorious beings and blaspheming. Here's an example of that. Verse 9. Yet when Michael the archangel was disputing with the devil, as they considered Moses' body, we'll talk about that source in a minute, even he, that is Michael, did not take it upon himself to pronounce a judgment that was blasphemous. Instead, Michael said to the devil, "May Lord Jehovah address you." Now, this text here is associated with a writing called the Assumption of Moses. And I have the Latin text and Latin translation by Johannes Trump here, the critical edition. Very good volume. Not easy to get, but unless you really have interest in these ancient texts, it's not necessary. But you can get a copy, probably even online, and look at the translation of the Latin, which is not always entirely reliable in terms of the way it's translated, as you'll see in some places. But we do not have the ending of the Assumption of Moses. The ending has been lost, and our only source for the ending is Jude and a 5th century writer named Gelasius, an ecclesiastical writer in the 5th century who's very accurate when it comes to quotations from the Greek Septuagint, which was likely included a copy of the Assumption of Moses, possibly in Greek, although some believe it was originally in Aramaic or Hebrew, and then Aramaic, and then Latin. Still, it could have been translated into Greek like many of the other Hebrew Aramaic texts, But the ending has been lost. So Jude, this text in Jude right here, is really our only remaining evidence from the lost ending of the Assumption of Moses. And you can tell, I've read the whole thing several times. You can tell that they're building up to the point where they're going to discuss Moses' body, just like Jude says, because they even in the text that we do have, discussion is had about how Joshua is like, how are we going to deal with your body, Moses' body, because Moses was from all over the place and very well known, and so they were used to burying their people with their fathers. But Moses was from Egypt, and then, of course, came and freed the Israelites and is now in the wilderness. So where would they bury him? He's about to die. And so this question is definitely being developed. And as the account in Jude states, at some point, it appears that Jah sent Michael the archangel to bury Moses. Some believe it was to take his soul to heaven, but Jude specifically refers to the body as the object of dispute. And some believe that the devil was accusing Moses of being a murderer because of how he killed the Egyptian. Although that could have been something forgiven by Jah in ways that the devil would not have had any basis for making that accusation at this point. Plus, Moses had already died, so he would have been acquitted of that sin. But that's not really what the text says. It's just a later conjecture by some. Basically Jude and Galatius are our only quotations of the ending of the Assumption of Moses. So, and they both basically confirm this dispute involving Michael and the devil over Moses' body. But you notice here, what we want to take away from this is the fact that Michael the archangel, who eventually resisted the princes of Greece and Persia and threw the devil out of heaven, at this point, when the devil was accusing Moses and trying to gain probably some authority over his body to use it as an idol or an object of some kind, Michael deferred to Jah, because at this point he hadn't been given authority to directly address or to obviously throw Satan out of his presence. So they had to deal with each other in these ways. Very similar. If you look at Zechariah 3:2, you'll see the angel of Jehovah, probably Michael, dealing with the devil in a very similar setting over the high priest Joshua. In Zechariah 3:2, you'll see right there, the devil's trying to stop him from serving as priest. But the angel of Jehovah resists him. And so we have these contests all the time that we just don't see. Even like with what we read in Daniel the other day about the Gabriel and Michael standing with him against the princes of Greece and Persia. So these things are always taking place in ways we simply don't fully recognize or understand, because they're involved with the affairs of the earth far beyond what I think we realize. But in any case, the text here makes it plain that even Michael, when dealing with someone like the devil, didn't blaspheme. Instead, now it was easier for Michael, obviously, because he's a perfect spirit son of God. He understands the ways. He's not limited by sin, whereas we sometimes do and say dumb things. He's still our example in this case, so that when we're disputing with somebody, we allow Jehovah to address the person who's being offensive. We just state the truth. We get passionate. Sometimes we want to state things correctly, and sometimes, just like Jesus himself, we address people as the fools they are, right? But he's dealing with the devil here, and this is a spirit being. And so it's not someone that we are even equal to in the sense that we could address him in that way, unless we're expelling him or a demon from someone they're abusing. We have authority for that. But we just can't go contesting the devil over all these different things and then negatively speaking to him like even Michael didn't do. But of course, this is before Christianity. This is before Jesus was given our authority and before we were given authority to bind and loose things on heaven and on earth. So we should never neglect rejecting devilish behavior or openly stating what something is. We don't want to hide the truth. We just want to try to be as respectful as we can, even to wicked spirit beings. Because we don't need to go beyond that. We don't need to go beyond reminding them that Jehovah will address you. Once they hear that, they know what's next. Verse 10, but the people about whom I am writing you. Remember, these are the ones they made him stop sharing the message about salvation so that he could deal with them. Verse 10, but the people about whom I am writing to you. On the one hand, they blaspheme whatever they do not understand. And if they don't understand something or agree, they just make light of it. They just start blaspheming it. Then on the other hand, whatever is instinctive they claim to know, like an animal without reason. And yet, according to these very same instincts, they've been brought to ruin. So what he's saying is that basically, remember in Jude 1 through 5, he said these people are without God, right? They've infiltrated into the congregations to deceive people, to make them morally unrestrained or corrupt them. So in their view, they're not really relying on Jah or the Holy Spirit. You know, that's why they blaspheme all these different things, just like the devil who would blaspheme people like even Jah himself, right? When he was in heaven, stated that Job would curse him to his very face. So he will take it upon himself to blaspheme the Most High, and that's why he's going to be judged the way he is. Because he's going to run with it all the way to the end until he gets caught. And Jah allows that because he's running with it. Jah will allow him to see to prove his point, which he cannot at this time. But now we go through the period where the Christ is bringing things to a completion. So he's at his end time since the coming of Jesus. Before that, when he was disputing with Michael over Moses' body, he is probably a lot more arrogant. And that's why he went in and dealt with Michael over this body. Probably he doesn't do a lot of that now. Maybe. But he knows it's over, right? His time is ticking. At this point, in his mind, he had it all. All he had to do was keep everybody sinning so that he could keep accusing them, and then everybody keeps dying, and then Jah cannot fulfill his original plan. And so in his mind, probably he would get possession of the earth being full of sinful people, not realizing that ultimately we would just destroy ourselves. But fortunately, Jah is going to prevent that because the devil did not see it coming. And until that time, we should be mindful, even if we have more authority as Christians. Michael is a good example in this way, and so is Jesus when he was dealing with the devil. We can tell him to go away. If he's trying to mislead us and tempt us, address him and go away. And then that's what he'll do. Or if he is allowed to keep testing us, keep doing those same things until he's no longer allowed to. But when it comes to these people, the ones infiltrating the congregations, the ones who come to our channel or get in our shows and want to talk about anything but the show or argue about things we've talked about so many times, there's really no value to do it again at all, except to build up our ego or maybe try to convince ourselves of things we really don't believe. I think that's often what they're doing. Because they don't believe. Look, that's what he said, right? These people are without God, yet they're in the congregation of Christians. So we know this was happening back then, and it's more than likely happening today. So we should be alert to these things so that we're not swept away with these people who don't pay attention to their own beginning, how they were made, their physicality, their anatomy, very obvious. We all have limitations and problems, but that's pretty obvious. We all know that abusing someone against their will sexually is not good. We wouldn't want that, yet the Sodom and Gomorrahites did it. And we see people doing it today. We see Hollywood promoting this idea of sodomy in both the original abusive way and in the more modern anal sex way. They're obsessed with it. Obsessed all the time with flesh. And not even the right kind or right areas usually. That's why it's abusive. So these are good examples for us to keep in mind so we don't get caught up in the things that this world often promotes. Oh man, they can get into such a frenzy over things that with music and movies and personalities, it can be tempting to just feel good about all this stuff. But it's terrible. If they're abusing other people and blaspheming Jah, what are they really doing that's good? Not much that I can see, if anything. So be alert to these things. We have these examples, a great text for us in terms of the content. And then I would say the most important thing, right? We know about the angels who didn't pay attention to their beginning. We know about Sodom and Gomorrah and the destruction that came to them and the obsession they had with all types of flesh. And we know about the account involving Michael and the devil and the dispute over Moses' body and how we should be considerate of glorious ones, even the devil. Although we don't follow him, obviously, but we don't need to be overly disrespectful or disrespectful at all to him. Then he'll just try to get us even more, right? So try to consider that. Don't give these wicked spirits further reason to hate you. They already do. So you can neutralize some of that, though, by not giving them further cause by being openly disrespectful. Let them do that. Then they're the ones who are going to have to deal with Jehovah. Oh, man. Even Michael knew that's the ultimate. And so, of course, I'm sure the devil, when he realized Michael said that, probably didn't say a lot more. Unless he really wanted to deal with Jah like that. And they don't. Right? Not now. Before the time of Jesus, it was much easier to go before Jah and accuse him of things or accuse others of things because the Son had not come to condemn the Satan as a liar, to show that he was wrong. And so now, whether or not he's as abrasive, who can say, but we are the ones on the earth representing Jah and Jesus. So he's going to try to blaspheme us. He's going to try to cause us trouble. We know that. So we should be alert to him, not dumb or ignorant of the things he does, the ways he uses to mislead people. Like these infiltrators. They are without God, but they think they have these great instincts, right? They can sense what's going on. Oh, they have this special intuition. Sometimes they even like to practice magic and different things that they think's giving them special insight. And yet all that seems to do is bring them face to face with someone's rear end. That's their great insight and wisdom, sodomy, or other things that are not according to our beginning, how we're made, right? I mean, I don't see Hollywood and these other people who are anti-Christian promoting this great way, this special benefit that if you just stop believing in God, you'll see. Oh, it's just the opposite. That's so funny. In any case, we can see. So keep your eyes open. Don't allow these people to distract you or deceive you. You can tell. Listen to what they say. Watch what they do. Nobody's perfect. But we know when someone's trying to and when someone's not trying to do better and not. And that's what we should look for. And when we see people trying, we should help them to the extent that we can. But every one of us has to stand on their own as well, like a man or a woman, and do your best. And when you need assistance, look to those who you can rely on, you can trust to the extent that you can. And then in that way, we can help each other to continue to grow, to learn from these accounts, and to be on the watch for people who are trying to infiltrate our groups and cause trouble. So if we can do that, I think we'll have a much better time reviewing these texts, trying to reach other people, and giving Jah praise in Jesus' name. So a lot of good stuff here. We covered pretty much all of these different accounts, gave some background information on the Assumption of Moses. So I hope that was helpful. Tomorrow we're going to do an open session, and I'm going to just start out with one topic. I'm going to start out the show with a discussion of Pharmakeia, the Greek word Pharmakeia, which sounds a lot like our English word pharmacy, and which is often related to drug uses of various kind, whether it's medicines or others, and spiritistic practices. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what Pharmakeia really means, and what kinds of things today might fall underneath the definition of Pharmakeia, according to the information that we have available to us. All right, that looks good. So it looks like we're good on the questions. Everyone seems to be focused on the material. Thank you for joining me, Betsy, Jack, Robert, Paul. There's a couple names I'm not entirely clear how to say, so I apologize. I'm not going to. Well, one, now let me give it a try here. You let me know if I get this right. Huioiesin Theo. Looks like someone's using a Greek word, a couple terms there, but it's not obvious, you know. So, in any case, I want to try to get that name out there. Oh, yeah, just taking a look at some of the questions. So, all right, very good. And of course, we have Nahal Heber there. So, thank you all for joining me. Be sure to tune in tomorrow if you can. Open session, 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I have other things too, but I'm going to leave it a little open after Pharmakeia. That's your chance. If you have questions on any of my videos or writings or just in general, almost anything. That's why I do those shows, so that when we're talking about these more predetermined programs, you know, and I don't want to get into unrelated or side issues, then these other shows like Open Session allow me to kind of recover some of those questions and hopefully give you some information. The cats are here. Hello, Dada. Little Dada. Oh, and by the way, I should point out, you know, when it comes to the Assumption of Moses, you remember I said this right here, Trump's edition. So, and I told you that the ending of the Assumption of Moses is basically lost, right? Except for what we have in Jude and in Gelasius of the 5th century. But you might like find in certain places texts of the of parts of the lost ending, but those are reconstructions. So I wanted to make that point as well, in case, for example, you have a book like this, the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament by Charles, very famous and competent 19th and 20th century scholar. This book's from around the early 20th century, and it contains translations of many of the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal writings, like the Assumption of Moses. But he reconstructed a lot of the text of the ending. Several scholars have attempted that. But I wanted to warn you that the reconstructions are in large part conjectures based on some fragmentary texts and then the rest of the document. So let me just say a little bit more on the Assumption of Moses. So there's things in the Assumption of Moses that, while it may be a document dating back to the time of Moses and kept in addition to the other writings and then carried through with the Jews either orally or in writing, at the time they date the text we have, the Latin text of the Assumption of Moses, to about the 1st century. And one of the reasons they do that is because in the text we have, it specifies the years 34 of a king, of a wicked king who would come, and of his sons. And it's the exact number of the years of Herod the Great that he ruled. And so that's either a predictive element in the Assumption of Moses regarding Herod, or information that was added to the text to create a fulfillment in some way with regard to Herod. And so you can understand why things like the Assumption of Moses are not in the collection of biblical texts, because they're not as reliable as the other writings. So while some of it may be accurate, right? Jude quotes from it, so clearly there was a document that they were using, or an oral tradition or understanding that they were using, that they accepted as consistent with the events of that time when Moses died. But not every single document was preserved with the same credibility and quality, or even entirely, so that some changes to the text could have been done, like specifying the number of years that Herod the Great ruled. So there are good reasons why we don't include all of these older texts in the Bible. It's not that they have no useful information. It's just that they're either incomplete, or there are things in them that may have been changed to fit certain time periods in ways that make the document less accepting or less acceptable, so less credible. So we have references like Jude and from others like Galatius that give us clues in the ending of the lost ending of the Assumption of Moses. But the overall text that we have, while it has a good amount of material in Latin, we only have a few fragments in Greek, really just the quotations from Jude and Galatius. So it's just not an entirely reliable text. All right, so don't go thinking you can get the Assumption of Moses or get Tromp's edition without the lost ending, and you're going to get just this whole new document of reliable information. It's worth reading. It does have some interesting information, particularly about the tribes of Israel and their eventual separation into the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. But it's not, you're going to read the English translation of a Latin text, and so it's not in every case going to make a lot of sense to you. But if you want to take a look at it, just keep in mind that it's not considered on the same level of credibility as the other biblical books, and for good reason. All right, so I wanted to make that point clear. So in case some of you, maybe you see Charles' edition, and Charles is he's a very he's a scholar, so he's not perfect. He makes mistakes like everybody else, but he's someone who people regularly use. And so you might find the Assumption of Moses in his volumes and think, well, here's more of the lost ending. No, most of that has been reconstructed. So be careful about that. Sometimes these scholars, and the reconstructions are not credible. Sometimes you can reconstruct a text based on partial words and the surrounding context. That's not what I'm talking about with the lost ending of the Assumption of Moses. It's pretty much gone, except for what we read in Jude and Galatius. So the reconstruction that you sometimes will see just is not reliable. Keep that in mind. Look to what Jude said. That's pretty much the most we're going to be able to determine at this point when it comes to the ending of what was known as the Assumption of Moses. Okay, so I hope that information was helpful to you all. Sometimes we hear about him quoting the Assumption of Moses, and it's a document many of us don't know a lot about. That's different from the Testament of Moses, by the way. There are a lot of different books kind of that describe certain things relative to these famous biblical figures, some of which may be original or related to events carried through tradition orally from those times. But we go based on the best available evidence. The Bible contains the best texts, the most credible. And while there are others, they're just not as credible to the extent that the biblical books are. So we use them only to the extent that we need to in order to better understand references like we see here in Jude 9. I thank all of you for joining me today. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Join me tomorrow for Open Session 7. We'll talk about Pharmakeia and a lot of other stuff. So until then, may you have a wonderful day, and may God bless you. In Jesus' name.